In this video, we'll have a look at how to keep your XG Firewall firmware up to date and roll back to a previous firmware version if necessary. Our software update technology makes it easy to keep your XG Firewall up to date with the latest firmware. When a firmware update is available, a notification will automatically appear in the control center of your firewall. Simply click through to the firmware update screen or navigate to the Firmware tab under Backup and Firmware. Then click the Download option next to the available firmware to download the firmware update, and then click Install to begin the update process. The firmware update requires a system reboot and will take at least a few minutes, so plan your update accordingly. After the update process is complete, you can log in and verify the new firmware is applied by checking the firmware version in the upper right portion of the control center. Alternatively, if your firewall is offline or unable to get the update automatically, you can download the firmware update manually from MySophos. In this case, log into MySophos and proceed to Network Protection, then Firmware Updates. Enter your serial number or choose the software virtual platform from the drop-down boxes and then download the firmware update file to your computer. Then return to your XG Firewall admin console, navigate to the Firmware tab under Backup and Firmware, and click the Upload Firmware icon in the empty firmware slot below your existing version in the firmware table. Select the firmware file and click Upload and Reboot to apply the update. Whenever a firmware update is applied, the previous firmware version is preserved, enabling you to roll back at any time if you need to do so. Navigate to the Firmware tab under Backup and Firmware, and identify the previous firmware version in the table at the top of the screen. Click the Boot Firmware Image icon in the table to restore that firmware version and reboot the device. Note that any configuration changes you've made between the upgrade and rollback will be lost.